All right, well, welcome to Three Creeks. If you're new, or you're just visiting for the first time, or maybe you're relatively new, you got to know that our church is about 7 years old, and this is actually the first time we've ever done a multiple-week series on finances, giving, money, etc. This isn't something that we've talked about generosity here and there, tucked into different series, but we've never just outright said, like, hey, this is the conversation that we're going to have as a church. And I'm not apologizing for that, but I am informing you that this is a little bit out of the norm. It's a unique 3-week series for our church, and I just want to say thanks for visiting and wanted to inform you of that. Imagine with me for a moment that you are in Kroger, and you have 2 or 3 items on the list, but it's one of those things that you're like, I don't know where that is. I'm just going to have to walk up and down every aisle until I actually see it. And so you begin walking up and down the aisles, and then up ahead you see a young woman with a toddler in her shopping cart. And as you get a little bit closer, you can just kind of feel the pressure that she's feeling. And you almost get this sense that she doesn't have enough to buy everything that she needs, because you see that she's got some coupons that she's trying to count, and she's even using the calculator on her phone to see if she can afford, how much of what she's looking at that she can afford. You can just kind of feel it. And she's got this little toddler in the cart, and you feel for her, but you've still got a couple items to get, so you just kind of keep moving on, and then you finally found these items, and then you go up to the self-checkout area, and none of them are open. You actually have to go wait in line. Can you believe it? This is a terrible day. You have to go wait in line for maybe up to 4 or 5 minutes. So you get in line, and you're actually third, and that woman beat you to it, and she is checking out. And the cash register worker is kind of running the items through the belt, and it's dinging, and it's dinging, and it's dinging, and you can see on this woman's face that as the price rises, she's beginning to feel more stress and more anxiety, a little bit of worry, wondering, is she going to have enough? She doesn't want to include her daughter in on this, but it's almost as if her daughter can even sense that her mom is feeling this way. And finally, there's a couple people stacking up behind you now, so everybody's frustrated that self-checkout isn't open. And then the cash register Kroger worker says the total amount, and you can just feel the stress and the anxiety pour over this young woman's face, because she realizes that she doesn't have enough. She doesn't have enough. And so she hands this gift card that somebody gave her, and it swipes and it says declined. And she says, can you try it again? And they swipe it again and it says declined. And she has to admit, you know what, I don't think there's enough on that card to get all these things. And so now she's feeling this pressure. She's a little bit embarrassed because she's got to go back and unscan different items. And now she's got to make decisions in real time while people are waiting impatiently in line, frustrated with her. Can you just feel the tension in that moment? You're third in line. You've kind of watched all of this happen. You can see the little girl in the shopping cart care for her mom as tears begin to stream down her face because of the embarrassment that she feels that she doesn't have enough. And just imagine for a moment that you look at the cash register worker as the mom is kind of sorting through the groceries, deciding which ones she can't afford. And you just kind of mouth to the worker, hey, how much? And she kind of looks at the mom, and she is almost unsure if she's allowed to tell you, but she looks back at you and she says, $73. Can I just ask, what would you want to do in that moment? What would you want to do? I can't imagine there's a person in the room who doesn't want to say, hey, I'll take care of it. I'll pay for it. I'll pay for it. That's what we all want to do. Now, whether we could or whether we would is a different story, but what would we want to do? We would want to step in the gap and say, I can take care of it. Because that's being generous. That's seeing somebody in need and saying, I can help. And we all want to be more generous. And then I'm just picturing it, you could say, I got it. And then the cash register worker could look at the person and say, hey, you know what? somebody decided to take care of this for you. And she would just feel so grateful. And as she's walking out with her little girl, maybe you kind of get to catch up with her in the parking lot and you just get to say, hey, God sees you. God loves you. You are important. You matter. And I'm just really glad that you were able to get everything you needed today. That whole experience would be so thrilling for her. She's blessed. Somebody gave her a gift. She's grateful. But then for the giver, maybe it's even better. We would go, we hear that and you go, man, I want to be more generous. Who doesn't want to be more generous? Being generous is awesome. We've probably all had a chance to maybe be generous. We certainly, each one of us has had generosity given to us, and we just would collectively say that generosity is awesome. It blesses the person that receives. It blesses the person that gives. It honors God because it reflects His heart and His character. But then, if a pastor gets up and starts going like, hey, let's have a conversation about generosity, we go, whoa, 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 whoa. Don't nudge me towards it. Let me figure out my own way. We agree that collectively we want to be generous, but we're not sure if we want people pushing us that direction. And I want to just go on record and say that is a valid concern. Your skepticism is justified because pulpits and pastors have used churches and congregations to manipulate them and steal from them. You've heard stories about leaders who embezzle money, Christian leaders who embezzle money, and manipulate crowds with stories and get them to give more. You're skeptical of that. Today, all over the country, pastors are standing up in pulpits and they're preaching something. Have you heard about the prosperity gospel? The prosperity gospel that says that if you give more to your church, God will give you more money in the future. That peace can only be found in financial security. That having riches or wealth is actually a sign of God's blessing on your life. That is being preached all over the country. It's not in the Bible. And also being preached all over the country is something called the poverty gospel, which means that you need to feel bad for every nice thing you own. That if you have anything nice and somebody says to you, hey, whoa, how'd you get that? You immediately have to justify it and tell them about the good deal you got. Or that it was a gift. That you need to be kind of ashamed of anything that you have that might seem like more than you need. That's not in the Bible either. Have you heard of preachers and sneakers? The Instagram account that highlights the shoes or the jewelry or the sweatshirts that pastors wear that are exorbitantly priced. Like $2,000 Easter Sunday sweatshirts. That's what's on preachers and sneakers. And there's a lot of content that you could put on there. And I'm just saying, I'm giving those examples to say, hey man, some of your concerns, some of your skepticism is justified. Is justified. We are not, here's a couple things I wanted to mention. The number one stressor in the life of an American is by a landslide money. The number one reason for divorce in our country is differences on how to spend money. Nothing gives people anxiety about their future like a lack of money. Jesus talked about money all the time because he knew that every single person was going to need some of it, and if mismanaged, it would lead to disaster. Money is very spiritual. And if you don't think it's spiritual, then I would propose that you don't think Jesus is very spiritual, because he talked about it all the time. We have not decided to do this series because we're in some sort of church budget crisis. We're not doing this because we desperately need more of your money. I just want to go on record and say that I am not personally motivated to have you be generous. If every single person in this room doubled what they gave to our church next week, I would still buy my shirts at TJ Maxx. I would still drive a CRV. And I would still drive in that CRV right by Whole Foods, wishing I could shop there, but understanding it's just not in the cards for me. And I'm not complaining. If you know me well, you've probably heard me say that I feel rich. I don't have that much money, but I feel like I am the richest man in the world. Both because I value things that are different than money. I feel so rich in the things that I value the most. But also, I need you to understand that I feel very well taken care of by the leadership of our church. I think I'm overpaid. And I'm not getting a raise if you give more. I just want you to understand, I'm not personally motivated by to give you this series because it's somehow going to come back and bless me. We've decided to go through this series because I want to help everyone in our church have an accurate theological understanding of money, giving, tithing, generosity, and the favor of God. I hope to be refreshingly honest, very transparent, answer some questions that you have, create some clarity around churches, budgets, how they work. I am proud of the way that our church uses our money, and I want you to be proud of it too. I don't want you to be in the dark. I want you to be confident and go, man, our church is prayerfully and carefully using the money that I give to our church to make a difference for Jesus. So 3 weeks, God and money. Let's not shelve it. Let's talk about it. Here are a couple questions I want to answer today, and if I don't get to them today, then week 2 and 3, I'll definitely try to touch on these. Here's really the question of the day. Does a Christian have to tithe 10% of their income to a church? You've been around church maybe, and if you have, you've heard of the word tithe, which is 10% of your income. Here's a few follow-up questions that I've had. Maybe you've had them too. Is it 10% pre-tax or post-tax? What if I give to a missionary or another ministry? Can that count towards my 10%? Do I have to tithe on the Christmas money my grandmother gives me? What is the difference, or is there one, between tithes and offerings? Should I tithe while I'm paying off college debt? Can I expect God to bless me if I tithe? Should I be able to choose where it goes? Or should I just blindly give to a general fund and let others determine how it's spent? I thought I knew the answer to some of these questions. As I studied a little bit more, a few answers changed for me, and I wonder perhaps if you'll have the same experience. Let's start here. Let's go back to the tithe. Introduced in the Old Testament, it literally means 1/10, 10%. That's what the word tithe means. And in Old Testament Israel operated, when the tithe was commanded, it operated under what's called a theocracy. In other words, they didn't have a king or a president. God was their ruler. And then God mediated his rule through Levites and priests who tried to uphold the Mosaic law that God gave Moses when the Israelites were wandering in the desert. This is all recorded in the book of Exodus, and some of it's in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. It was the Old Testament law. It was the way that the Israelites, Jews, could conduct themselves to honor God. That was why the law was given to them in the Old Testament. The Levites and priests, they did not own any land. All the other 11 tribes, they got pieces of land so that they could farm them, have animals on them, grow vegetables on them so that they could eat and provide for themselves and their families. But the Levites and the priests, they didn't get any land. They were the ones that were kind of scattered, spread out into all the other 11 territories, but they didn't have a place to farm or raise their animals. So the law was that every person had to give a tithe, a tenth of what they made, to the priests and the Levites, and it was less of a generous gift and more of a tax. It was actually their way of funding what served as their government at the time. And it wasn't always money. It could have been grain, oil, tomatoes, whatever came in, whatever you brought in. The requirement was that you would give 10% away to the Levites and the priests as they led the people. So if 100 tomatoes came in, then you would have to take 10 tomatoes, the best tomatoes, the tomatoes off the top, and you would have to set them aside and give them to the Levites and priests because their work was to lead the people. It wasn't to farm the land. Leviticus 27:30 is one of the many verses that describes this. It says, 1/10 of the produce of the land, whether grain from the fields or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord and must be set apart to him as holy. So this essentially means that they would set aside 1/10 of everything they made for God. But that wasn't the only tithe. Did you know this? There was a second tithe. another 10% that had to be given to the theocracy, if you will, for all of the feasts and the festivals that they would have throughout the year. Partying was a big deal for Israelites. They celebrated significant moments in their history by throwing feasts and festivals. And so every person was required to give another 10%, another tithe for that specifically. And then there was another tithe. It was a tithe for the poor. But this one only had to be given every 3 years. So a third of the people would give it this year, and then a third of the people would give it this year. But if you do the math, that means that 3.33% more had to be given each year. So now we're up to 23.33%. And then there was another fixed tax or fixed amount that they had to give. It was called the temple tax. And then on top of that, if they were a farmer, they couldn't harvest the corners of their field. Because the poor people it was required that they would leave the corners of the field unharvested. So if anybody was in need, they could go harvest for themselves enough food to eat. And so if you're doing the math, it's somewhere between 24, 25, 26% of a person's income would be given away either to the church, to the leaders of the church, for the festivals that celebrated their history, or to the poor. This was a lot more, this is important, this was a lot more like a tax system than it was this beautiful picture of generosity. And in the Old Testament, there are other examples where people are asked to come and give. When they're building the temple, a few hundred years after what I'm talking about, when they're building the temple, they say, come and bring your offerings. And people bring gold and silver and food for the workers. And in fact, they had so much that they said, enough. We have enough to build the temple. So there are examples of these free will offerings in the Old Testament, but the tithe is not one of them. It really is kind of a tax system that funded what served as their national government. There are slight variations to the numbers that I just gave you, interpretations, different scholars, but almost everybody would agree that we're in the ballpark in that 24, 25, 26% number. So then it begs the question again, does a Christian now have to tithe? Is that how it works? If you grow vegetables, do you need to bring 10 tomatoes of the 100 that you grow to the church? And the answer to that is yes. No, I'm just kidding. We do love fresh salsa. The simple answer is no. That things have changed. That when Jesus comes onto the scene in the New Testament, things changed. And the Old Testament Mosaic law has changed. The application has changed. This is what Paul wrote to the Romans 2,000 years later that had some of those same questions. Do we have to obey all those laws? In Romans 7:6, he writes, but now, by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. The tax code has changed. He goes on to say, this is important, that the law isn't necessarily bad. Christians, though, are not bound by the letter of the law in the Old Testament, but the spirit or the intent of the law are still that were given are still in the heart of God. Being generous towards others, being generous to your church, being generous to the poor, that is still in play for people who follow God, but the rule of the tithe doesn't apply anymore. So that would mean that anyone who commands or demands that you give 10% to your church is at best ill-informed. That is the wrong percentage. We're preaching the wrong covenant, and we're preaching the wrong motivation if that is what we're trying to do. Jesus, his disciples, Paul, who wrote a lot of the New Testament, often talk about money and generosity and giving, never attribute a percentage to what that means. Because of Romans 6, we are not under the law, we are under grace. Things have changed. So, if you're thinking to yourself right now, wait a minute, does that mean I'm off the hook for my 10%? The answer to that is, in some ways, yes. You're off the hook. It's not a law. So what about us? What does this mean? Can we find any practical advice, any guidance in the New Testament? Let's see what Jesus says about money. Matthew 6, verse 19. Jesus says to all the people that are interested in perhaps following him, he says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven." Jesus reminds us that we don't get to take anything with us. He reminds us that hearses don't pull U-Hauls. You know what I mean? He goes on to say that no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, or you're to be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Jesus wants all the followers to get it right out of the gate. The number one competitor for the throne of a human heart is money. And it's impossible to be a Christian and define success as worldly wealth. If we are defining the success of life based on how much we make, we are not serving God, we're serving money. And you can't serve both at the same time. Jesus actually said this too. This is interesting. He says, "I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings." If you look at the context within which Jesus said this, what he's saying is use your money for others-oriented gospel enterprises so people will be blessed and ultimately people will be converted and those people will welcome you into heaven one day. Play the long game. Not the long game like retirement. Play the long game, the eternal game with your money. In Revelation 3:17, Jesus speaks in this vision to John, and John writes it down. This is what Jesus said to the Laodiceans, and this one is good. He says, "You say, Laodiceans, I am rich. I have acquired wealth and do not need a thing, but you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked." What this means is that being financially wealthy isn't the way that a Christian defines being rich. We are allowed to say that we are rich when we don't have hardly any money. Worldly wealth does not equal riches. And in many cases, God says that looks like poverty to me. These are things Jesus said. These are principles. But to be fair, there hasn't been a lot of practical advice quite yet. But Paul helps us out. This is what Paul wrote to the Corinthian church when they were asking questions about how much they had to give to their church now that the law wasn't a rule anymore. And this is what Paul wrote to them. He said, "Each of you should give whatever you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." Again, it begs the question, so is that like what, 10%? For some, 10% is unfathomable. 1 or 2% would be generous for some. And for others, 10% wouldn't really touch you. You really wouldn't even feel it. That's why it's not a rule anymore. So to the person who's asking, like 10%, here's how I would answer the question. Brothers and sisters, why would you desire to give any less? Why would you want to do any less? When you hear the word tithe, or when you hear 10%, or why in your heart would you want to resist that? It's really a deep heart question that we ought to wrestle with for longer than the 10 seconds I've just given you. Jesus knew that the way people spend their money was a window to their heart. He actually said that where your treasure is, that's where your heart's at. He knew that the things that you love the most, care about the most, desire the most, is going to be the place that your money goes. It's this reflection of a heart. And for me, and for my wife and our family, man, we're not batting 1,000. But my hope, my desire would be that if you looked at my bank account, if you looked at my credit card statement, if you looked at any transaction that I'm making, my desire would be that if you set your eyes on that, that quickly you would go, that family really loves God. It is clear to me that they love God the most. Because where we spend our money is the best reflection of where our heart is at. That's why my family gives, and I want to encourage you to do the same. Here are 2 reasons that I want to encourage you to consider giving to gospel enterprises, our church being one of them, but I want to explain a little bit more about how this might work itself out in your life. Here are 2 reasons why. Number 1, giving keeps God's work moving. God determines our vision, but our collective generosity determines the speed at which we can take it on. I'll just be honest, there are some things that we feel like we want to do, are called to do, want to step into, that simply put, we cannot afford at the moment as a church. This is a little bit more of a family conversation. If you're visiting, you're just kind of getting a glimpse into kind of where we're at and what we see as our next steps as a church family. In January and February, we had some meetings with our elders and our elders' wives, and we were talking. We were just essentially asking the questions like, where are the weak spots? Where are the opportunities? How can we better serve our people? And we came up with a list of things that we would love to step into as a church, more ministry that we want to see happen. But we can't afford them. Honestly, we just can't currently afford them. And so I want to be clear that if we collectively as a church do not collectively respond to some of these messages and what Jesus says in the Bible, then we cannot do these things. But I want you to hear me say that if we collectively together all respond to these messages, this is what is next. This is what's on the list of things that we want to do next. A lot of our fixed costs are set. Like we still have to rent the middle school. We still got to pay for Spotify. We still have a mortgage on the well. Like those are set. And honestly, I don't really see those going up much. And so everything, our budget right now is pretty balanced and it's where it's at. So any increase in giving that our church does over the next few weeks, the next few months, I want you to know where it's going for. If you've ever wondered where it's going, I'll just tell you, this is what's going to happen. If you want to know where your giving would go to, this is where it'd go to. Here are 6 or 7 initiatives that we want to try to take on over the next 12 to 18 months. Here we go. Number 1, we would love to hire a full-time discipleship director, women's ministry director. This would be, by a landslide, in our estimation, the healthiest thing for Three Creeks Church going forward. We need someone to care specifically for the women in our church. There's so much going on, and I'm just not the guy to go one-on-one with women in our church who want to be guided and shepherded and led spiritually. We need to hire a full-time discipleship director and women's ministry director. Number 2, we want to invest more in Three Creeks youth. I just got to pull back the curtain and just tell you kind of, Tommy Tutelo came here for free. We found him a place to stay. Praise God for Jeff and Beth Gilger, who housed him for like 6 months when he got here. But he came here believing in faith that at some point God would make a way financially for him to stay here. Tommy's been here for 9 or 10 months, maybe something like that. 2 weeks ago, he had 23 students at a youth event that he put on, a volleyball night here in town. Tommy has been teaching, substitute teaching, Mondays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, every single week. He coached JV volleyball at the high school, and there's a tremendous amount of momentum in our youth program. I've got a first grader. She's going to be in 6th grade in like an hour. And I want Three Creeks youth to be ready to roll when she gets there. Halfway through this year, we said, Tommy, you're doing an awesome job. And so we essentially said, you have deserved this. You deserve more than this. We started paying him $1,000 a month to do what he's been doing with our students. We want more of Tommy, basically, is what I'm trying to say. We want to have him substitute teach a little bit less and serve Three Creeks students and work out of the well a little bit more. If I rolled out his strategic plan for the fall, you would give a standing ovation. He's ready to roll. He's talking about getting into high school football games and trying to expose people to what's going on. I'm telling you, this is a great place to make an investment. And so what we want to do is we want to invest more. Three Creeks has had a 0% budget this year. 0. And so we want to give youth a budget, and we want to double the amount of time that Tommy's working by doubling the amount of money that we're giving him. Number 3, we want to start a young adult ministry. If we don't start a young adult ministry, we are all going to get old and go, man, where are all the young adults? It's what's going to happen. It's already happening. No. But we do, man. We've got a crew of like 20 or 30 young adults in this church, and it's time to put some money behind our ministry towards that generation. People in their 20s. We've got to do it. Number 4, we want to help you go to counseling. I talk to people all the time in our church who want to go to counseling, personal counseling, marriage counseling, and the number one barrier is the money. I don't know if I can afford it. We want to set aside $10,000 to help people go to counseling. We'll pay 80% of the counseling bill if you'll put up 20% to make it happen, because we believe that that would be so good for you. We want to start an adoption grant fund. Adoption is expensive. It's like 30 grand plus. We just went through it. It's ridiculous, but it's how it works. And we want to help families in our church become adoptive parents and help birth moms choose life by stepping into that space. We want to increase our investment in local and global impact ministries. We want to serve more people in Gehenna. We want to give more money to My Village Ministries. We want to support our missionaries even better. We want to give financial support for people that are going on our mission trip to Mexico in November. And last but not least, we want to start saving for our long-term home here in Gehenna. We would not be getting the well today if we hadn't saved years ago for the well today. We want to start planning towards having, the well is amazing. It seems funny to talk about this today, but the well is going to be great. And I don't know how long it's going to be our main home. It's just going to be our main home, during the week until one day we hope to take step 2 and have a place that we can have Sunday morning too. So we're going to start saving towards that. And I want you to understand, we can't do any of these things unless we collectively respond. And if we collectively respond, this is what we plan on doing. We actually built a budget, our elders built a budget that would include these things. And we're not going to be able to do them unless we respond collectively to these things and we say, yeah, we believe in this. So giving fuels God's work. And number 2, giving keeps my heart healthy. I already said it, but our hearts can't serve two masters. It's God or money. And a heart that serves money is so stressed out. Eventually, it dies. It is so disappointed. A heart that serves money is always disappointed. It's always disappointed. And a heart that serves God is one that can be at peace. It's a heart whose joy does not go up and down based on whether the stock market went up or down. There's a steadiness to the joy and the peace of a heart that serves God instead of money. I just want to close with a story, and I just want to try to encapsulate what generosity means and what generosity does. So we just adopted Moses a couple weeks ago, right? And that's been, well, we'll get into that later, but about a week before, yeah, I think so. About a week before, I had a friend text me kind of out of nowhere in a group. His name is Garrett. And Garrett just threw the text out like, hey, how's everybody doing? And what was on my mind at the time was, we're going to adopt a baby on Monday. That was what was going on for us. And Garrett was like, no way. We haven't talked about this in a long time. We haven't really talked in a while. And Garrett, he says, he texts the group and says, how can we help? And I said, diapers and Chipotle gift cards. Both of those things would be tremendously helpful to us at this time. And he pried a little bit further, and he said, no, like, how can we help? How much money do you need? And I said, adoption is like $30,000 or so. And fortunately for us, we've had 3.5 years to save quite a bit towards that. And we had a lot of people, friends, family, people from our church step in and give us money to help make this happen. Couldn't have done it without help. And so I said to Garrett, we are a little short. At the moment, I said, we're about $5,000 short. And Garrett responded, send me your wire info. And I said, what is wire info? Never had anybody do this before. I said, hey, we have a few grant applications out there, and we're waiting to hear back, so it might not be the full $5,000, but we'll know soon. And Garrett said, call me when you know the remaining number you need. We will bridge the rest of the gap. Tell Morgan we're here to help. And I had to scroll up to make sure I hadn't said $500. I said, you really did see 3 zeros after that 5. And he sent me a screenshot of his phone making that amount liquid, ready to give after we hear about the grants. These are Garrett's words, not mine. I'm a hypocrite if I go to work in the marketplace and don't do anything with my money that matters. And then, he texted me on Wednesday night this week. He said, hey, Joel, on a plane, praying for Moses. Praying for Moses' birth mom. Moses is God's. So is Moses' birth mom. Praying God will use this to show her kindness. Salvation is of the Lord. See, for Garrett, this isn't just about money. Like, God has Garrett's heart in every way. Garrett's master is not money. Garrett's master is God. And this is this incredible act of generosity that has been given to me and to my family and to Moses. And it would just be atrocious if I responded to the generosity that's been given to me by being really stingy with others. You would look at me and point your finger and go, what's wrong with you? Because generosity given towards us fuels us to go, how can we not be generous towards others? I told Garrett, I said, bro, you think this is landing with us, but you got to believe me, man. I'm going to do everything I can to pay this forward when somebody else needs it. Because generosity inspires other people to be generous. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful when a heart is generous and isn't owned by money. And when it's just given away. And I just got to close by asking you a couple questions. Has God been generous to you? Did he send his son for you? Did Jesus willingly go to the cross for you? Is that the most generous thing that anybody has ever done for anyone? The answer is yes. That is the most generous act in history. And so for me, I can't put this on you because I'm not sure where you stand on that, but I believe those things to be true. And it is from that place of being a receiver of generosity that I have to step out and go, you know what? I'm just not going to live for myself. I'm not going to store up treasure on earth. I'm going to let money be God be my master, not let money be my master, and live for the kingdom of God. And live like this, because it's better to give than it is to receive. Thanks for watching. To find out more about our church, about when and where we meet, about joining a group, about serving on a team, about giving online, you can find all of it at threecreekschurch.com.